Hello fellow travelers and welcome to episode number 7 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. I've been looking forward to this episode for weeks. Don't take me wrong, I loved all the heroes and heroines and the legends we've met until now and the ones you're going to meet in the future. If I didn't, I wouldn't have started this podcast at all. But I've always felt particularly attracted to the histories and the stories of one part of the European continent. I am a happy child of the Mediterranean, and as someone who freezes with astounding regularity, Swiss winters are slightly too cold for my tastes. I wouldn't trade away the sunny beaches I grew up with for anything in the world. But if I didn't feel more at home in the scorching heat than in the freezing snow, I would have liked to call the north of Europe my home. It is with great pleasure and a worried-eyed on the temperatures outside that today I'm swapping my hiking gears for 2 or 3 layers of extra warmth in order to step on a sturdy wooden ship, which will take me and you on an adventure to the limits of the known world in the Middle Ages and beyond them. The starting point of this episode brings us to Scandinavia, a region in the north of Europe, which most commonly refers to Denmark, Sweden and Norway. Here, we'll need to find a trusted captain and crew that will take us to our destination. Where are we going, though? Or, an even better question, what are we setting out to do? In this port we are visiting, we're spoiled for choices. There are many different ships, all going to different places with very different functions. In front of us, a Knarr is being loaded with barley and other crops. This big sea-going trading ship is about to embark in a voyage towards Iceland to bring much-needed supplies to the settlements there. It'll come back full of dried codfish. A little to the left, a smaller ship, a carver, is getting a much-needed makeover. It was used as a passenger-carrying ship, but now it is being fitted to transport supplies and equipment to the longships, busy raiding the coast of England. Anchored offshore, we can barely make out the shapes of the longships, of the warships. They are beautiful, if not quite scary, fully decked with monsters carved into the wood to scare the enemies and to ward off the spirits of the seas. One stands apart from the other. It's bigger, more decorated, with a dragon on its bow. It's a drake ship, the king's ship, the only person who could have had a dragon as a protector. Who are all these people here, though? They're not just farmers, for some of them have carried their goods in the ships and have taken their places at the oars. They're not just traders, for no simple merchant would be armed to the teeth. They're not just warriors, for even the warships carry cargo in their holds. They're all 3. Let me welcome you to the age of the Vikings. When we think about the Vikings, most of us would probably conjure up a pretty standard image. A well-toned warrior, scarred and tattooed all over, with a long, maybe unkempt blonde or reddish mane, with matching beard or moustache, a big axe, a penchant for drinking, and a rather incandescent temper. Oh, and let's not forget the horn helmets. Apparently, you can't have a proper Viking without a horn helmet, which I disagree with, but we'll see about that later. Most past and present representations give us this sort of standard image of a Viking, which is not wrong per se, but I think it comes off as a bit narrow-minded. Yes, they were pirates and raiders, which is the meaning of the word Viking. They did loot and plunder for the most part in unprovoked attacks. Their fearsome reputation reached not just their neighbouring lands, but also as far as the Arab kingdoms, for we have Arab chronicles which describe them in the exact same details I used. Many churches have lost their treasures to them, many men their lives, and many women were taken away to be prisoners or worse. They've been the nightmares of many villages, and nobody's denying that. I don't think any English or Irish village would have been particularly happy to see the longships on their shores. I mean, would you have been happy to open your door and find Ivar the Boneless on your doorstep? Before you start thinking that it might have been nice to invite him and his men in for tea, let me tell you a little bit more about the character in question. He is better known as the Viking chieftain who, alongside two of his brothers, Halfdan and Hubba, invaded Great Britain in the year 865 with the pretext of avenging their father, who had died after having been supposedly cast into a pit full of venomous snakes by orders of the Northumbrian king Ella. I can't tell you more about the snakes because we really don't have that much information, but this goes to show that sometimes the Viking raids might not have been quite so unprovoked. Ivar Sobrike, the Boneless, might refer to either an hereditary skeletal condition or to his inability to walk. Or, the one explanation I prefer, according to the saga dedicated to his father, the tale of Ragnar Lodbrok, his bonelessness was the result of a curse, of which he was the innocent victim. Ragnar had been told by his newly wedded wife, Aslog, that he needed to wait 3 days before consummating the union. When asked for the reason for such a delay, Aslog had told Ragnar that their child would be born as a monster if they were to have intercourse before the 3 days. Ivar's Sobrike is all the information we need to know that Ragnar did not, in fact, wait the prescribed 3 days. Not that his condition prevented Ivar from becoming the scourge of the British Isle. I'm not trying to make the Vikings look cuddly, because they weren't. But can we just label them as the hordes of hell and move on? Reducing the age of the Vikings to a simple laundry list of massacres and pillaging and unwarranted destruction of property feels like we're missing something. Like a key aspect which made the Vikings who they were. Many of them were also poets, and they have left us a collection of stories, the Nordic sagas, which I personally find weepingly beautiful at times and tremendously hilarious at others, although I suspect that they do lose something in the translation. One of the most famous Norse poets is perhaps Egil Skallagrimsson. His life and that of his family is chronicled in Egil's saga. It is interesting to notice that this saga is the only source of information on Egil, as his life is not historically recorded otherwise. This is not unusual. As written documents became popular late in Scandinavia, as late as the 12th century, in many cases our only sources of information are the spoken sagas, which got written down at some point, usually from the 13th century onwards. Sagas are an interesting source of information because they combine historical facts with some mystical context, which makes for a very entertaining, if not quite accurate, read. Egil's saga spans almost 2 centuries, and it recounts the story of not just its namesake, but of his entire family, right up to his grandchildren. As I said, upon reading a saga, one has to differentiate fact from fiction, but one also has to pay attention to literary tropes. Some parts of Egil's life are presented in the saga as such. He is presented as a multifaceted individual, and his nature reflects the qualities that we find in his entire family. It's less about who Egil really was, and more about what he represented. His story in the saga spans his entire life. It starts in his boyhood, when, we are told, Egil composed his first skaldic verse at the age of 3 and killed his first person at the age of 7, when he brought an axe down on the head of another boy who had bested him in a competition. Both the poetry and the violent temper are integral parts of Egil's character. He was famous both for his physical prowess. We are told in the saga that he was so strong that one evening he slammed a friend dead against the ground, and for his poems. His most famous one is a 20 stanzas poem titled Head Ransom. I will not attempt to pronounce it in its original language. It was composed in one night in honor of King Erik Bloodaxe, as a way for the king to spare Egil's life after he had killed the king's son. The poem evidently worked because, surprised by the quality of the writing, Erik Bloodaxe spared him, provided Egil never set foot in front of the king again. I think Egil represents well the dichotomy of the Vikings, prone to violence, yes, but also capable of great sensitivity. I have little doubts that, for a lot of people, seeing a dragon head on the bow of a ship would have been cause for nightmares, but many others have profited from the globe-trotting ways of the Vikings. They went everywhere, not just to Europe. They went west, but they also went east, towards what is now Russia and Ukraine. Under the name of Rus, they are thought to have contributed to the formation of the Princedom of Kiev. They pop up, surprisingly, in Arab sources in the 9th and the 10th century, and they might have even got as far as Baghdad, in modern-day Iraq, if we want to believe the one single mid-9th century source. We have to be careful not to make the mistake of leaning too much towards the other side. Yes, the Vikings were extraordinary explorers and traders, as well as poets and farmers, but they were also pirates. Allow me to dispel one last myth about them. It's one of my personal pet peeves. No, they did not wear horned helmets. I personally think those are a fashion disaster and an eyesore, and we have Wagner, yes, the composer Wagner, to thank for them, as they were created for the first time as props for the performance of his Ring Cycle in 1876. And even if they hadn't been props, they wouldn't have been worn in battle. Horned helmets are completely useless in a battle, as the horns only add weight to the helmet, making it more unstable and thus less likely to do its job as an object meant to protect. The Vikings did use horns as containers to drink from or as a way to communicate over long distances. They just didn't put them on wearable items. Did Wagner's props team completely invented them? No, not quite. Archaeologists have found one ceremonial horn helmet in the River Thames, but for one, it was a ceremonial, not a battle helmet. For two, it belongs to the Iron Age, which means roughly 800 years before the Vikings. Now that I've taken this last weight off my chest, it's about time I introduce the characters for this episode, right? We've seen the raiders and the pirates. We've met the poets. In this episode, though, I would like to concentrate your attention on the explorers. Let me introduce to you Eric the Red and his family. Egil's life story wasn't the only one handed down to us through the sagas. The information we have about Eric the Red and his family comes mostly from two sagas, the so-called Vinland sagas. These are two separate works which were written down independently in Iceland in the 13th century. Individually, they're called the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. These two sagas sometimes run counter to each other, so when possible, I will highlight the difference between the two. As I said, sagas are a mixture of facts and fiction, but the historical elements contained in them have been proven true by historians and archaeologists when they found traces of structures in Newfoundland, Canada, which were the same as those found in Iceland and Greenland in the same period. While Eric the Red is most commonly associated with Iceland and Greenland, his story began, like many other Viking stories, in Norway. He was born right in the middle of the 10th century in Rogaland, Norway, and lived there for the first 10 years of his life. Then, one day, he and his family were suddenly forced to flee Norway and settle in Iceland. Why, you ask? Because his father, Thorvald Asvaldsson, had been found guilty of some killings. We have no more information than that, and I cannot decide whether it's because written tradition was still spotty in Norway at this time, or because it was such a common occurrence that chroniclers had no reason to add more details than this. I think it's a combination of the two, especially since later in life, Eric would prove to have taken after his father not just in looks. Anyway, as per Scandinavian law, Thorvald Asvaldsson and his family were exiled from Norway, and he decided to settle them all in the northwestern Iceland, in the Hornstranded region. There he lived peacefully, and we can assume lawfully, as we have no more mentions of Thorvald Asvaldsson until the end of his life. At his father's death, Eric married a woman named Theotild Jorungsdottir. I think it's a pity there isn't much information about her, because from what little I managed to find, she must have been a formidable woman. She came from a wealthy family. She gave her husband 3 sons and 1 daughter, although the legitimacy of Freydish is somewhat in doubt depending on the saga, moved to icy Greenland with her husband and settled it, and she was a pillar of the new Christian religion which had come to the shores of Greenland thanks to her son, Leif. The first church in Greenland was built by her, bearing her name, and she was one of the first to convert away from paganism and the Old Norse gods. She went to her maker with a series of successes and one failure. Her husband, Eric the Red, would never convert to Christianity, preferring to die as he had lived, a follower of the old gods. Evidently, such a decision didn't sit particularly well with Theotild because, and I quote directly from the saga of Eric the Red, after her conversion, Theotild refused to sleep with Eric, much to his displeasure. If his father had chosen to fade back into obscurity, Eric the Red, though, was destined for grandness. After his marriage, he moved with his wife to the south of Iceland, the same region where today millions of tourists flock to see the famous Strokkur and Geysir geysers. There he built his homestead, to which he gave the name Erikstadir. This would be but the first of many landmarks which would bear his name in the future. In this longhouse, all of his children would be born, and all of them would leave their own mark onto posterity. Eric the Red might have been a restless soul by nature. His sobriquet, the Red might have been given to him because of his fiery red hair and beard, or also because of his incandescent temper. And it was that hot temperament which catapulted him from the shadows into the light of history, although probably not in the way he might have wanted. According to the sagas, one day Eric the Red's thralls, his slaves, were doing some work on his lands, and they accidentally triggered a landslide, which fell on his neighbour's farm. Both the sagas claim it was an accident. His neighbours, Valtjof, was of a different opinion. Valtjof sent a kinsman of his, Eyjolf the Foul, to kill the slaves. Eric didn't particularly appreciate such action and retaliated by killing Eyjolf and one of his kinsmen. As punishment for these killings, Eric was exiled from his home for 3 years, even though he was still able to live in Iceland. As Eric had to leave his homestead behind, he left one of his most precious possessions in the safekeeping of his friend, Thorgest. At this point, allow me to apologize once again for what I suspect is an atrocious pronunciation, but I would like to tell you the correct name for those possessions at least once. What Eric left with Thorgest were his setstokkr. According to the Old Icelandic Dictionary, a setstokkr is what we would likely call today a support beam. They weren't just any beams, though. They were ornated pieces of wood of significant mystical value, which were passed down from father to son in the same family. The ones that Eric had left with Thorgest had come from Norway, when he as a child had escaped with his father, Thorvald Asvaldsson. I assume that Eric either couldn't bring them with him or didn't want to risk them, as he might not have had a homestead where to put them yet. The saga mentions that Eric had lent them to Thorgest, but for which purpose I cannot say. Once he finished his new house in the new location, Eric asked Thorgest to give back what was his. Thorgest denied him, although neither saga tell us why. Feeling wrong, Eric went to Thorgest's house and took some beams by force. We don't know if his or Thorgest's. It was now Thorgest's turn to feel slighted, and he decided to give chase. In the fight that ensued, Eric killed Thorgest's 2 sons and other men. What had started as a simple quarrel had grown so out of proportions that they were all brought in front of the Thing, which was the governing assembly, where Eric was charged with outlawry and exiled for 3 years. Now that he couldn't stay in Iceland anymore, Eric the Red decided to find his fortunes elsewhere. He made his intentions known that he would sail westwards, looking for the land that Gunnbjorn Ulfsson had discovered nearly a century before. That land was Greenland. Many people credit Eric the Red with the discovery of Greenland, but as we said, Icelanders of Eric's time already knew about his existence, but had never tried to settle it, because the attempt made by Gunnbjorn Ulfsson had ended in disaster due to unfavorable weather conditions. While Eric the Red was not the one who discovered it, he is nonetheless the first to settle Greenland permanently. He spent 3 years there, colonizing the land as he went by, giving out toponyms, mostly based on his own name, like Eriksea or Eriksfjord. As Iceland had been already settled by the time he had come to the island, Eric had not had much space to make a name for himself. In Greenland, though, he could be the first and carve out a place for him and his family. He couldn't do it alone, though, and so, after the 3 years of exile had passed, he went back to Iceland to recruit more people to the cause. He knew not many would leave the relatively abundance of Iceland for a land under the cover of ice, so he resorted to a bit of let's say, marketing manipulation. Nobody would move to a frozen tundra, but people would flock to a land reaching greenery, right? So he named the new land Greenland. I'm not quite sure that the first settlers appreciated the joke as much as Eric did, especially since of the 25 ships which had departed from Iceland to settle Greenland, only 14 made land. But that name notwithstanding, the settlers made do, and soon 2 different settlements were created. The Eastern and the Western settlement, both on the southwest coast, as it was and is the only place suitable for living. Under the rule of Eric the Red, paramount chief of Greenland, both the settlements grew, exchanging luxury goods like ivory for basic necessities like wood. Now wealthy and greatly respected, Eric's life was finally settled. Before his end, though, he would make a brief appearance in the story of the most famous of his children, Leif Erikson, also known as Leif the Lucky. The story of Leif is told in both sagas, although with quite a difference between them. His existence is the only thing which is not in question, which is quite fortunate since historians have been debated whether or not his sister, Freydish, is a work of fiction. He's best known as the first European to set foot and build a settlement in continental North America. His story starts, much like his father's, in Norway. Erik would never return to the land of his birth, but his son, Leif, would serve the king of Norway, Olaf Tryggvason. It was at this court that Leif was converted to Christianity, and he was given, directly from the king, the task to go and convert Greenland, thus initiating his father's exile from the marital bed. It is in the description of his return voyage to Greenland that the 2 sagas diverge. According to the saga of Eric the Red, Leif's ship was blown off course and they made land in a place they had never seen before. For Nordic people, well used to the rigors of winter, this new land might as well have been paradise. Immense forests and a mild climate, so perfect that wild edible plants grew everywhere. Leif christened this newly discovered land Vinland, quite literally translated wineland, because with grapes growing everywhere, it felt as if wine was coming directly from the soil. Such a discovery was quite a lucky jackpot for the Greenlanders. Greenland was not a land of abundance by any means. Sure, they had the ivory tusks of the walrus, which made the settlers a tidy sum, but they lacked the necessities to live a Viking life. There is, and there was no wood in Greenland, at least not the type of wood which was used to build the longships. The settlers imported it from Norway or from Iceland, but the supply was always lower than the demand. Finland could solve all of their problems. The Greenlanders saga differs a bit from this version. Leif is still the first to settle Vinland, but not quite the first to discover it. According to this saga, it's not Leif's ship that gets blown towards Vinland. The crew of this ship doesn't settle this new land, doesn't even give it a name, but returns quickly to Greenland, where rumors of this new, bountiful land start to circulate. Leif, aware of Greenland's supply problems, is quite taken by this new discovery, so much so that he buys the longship and the crew and goes to this new land to settle it properly. In both cases, the honor of the first settlement goes to Leif Erikson. The discovery and settlement of a new, prosperous land is quite a lucky break, right? And yet, Leif owes his sobriquet to something else. On the voyage back to Greenland, he saved a skiff with 15 people, thus earning the nickname Leif the Lucky. What about Eric the Red? I told you that before his end he would have a minor role to play in his son's venture. As Leif was preparing his voyage to Vinland, he asked his father to come with him. Eric, though, had quite exhausted his adventurous spirit, so he declined. Leif insisted so much that in the end Eric accepted. The day of the departure, as Eric was riding towards the port, his horse buckled and threw him off the saddle. The physical consequences weren't that dire, but Eric took this as an ill omen and decided to stay in Greenland. Considering that while his son was away discovering a new land, Eric died, possibly of a pestilence brought by traders or due to the fall from his horse, it probably would have been less of a bad omen to go. As Leif came back from Vinland, he assumed the title held by his father of Paramount Chief of Greenland, both because he was the firstborn of the old chief and because his expedition had given him quite the reputation. He would never go back to Vinland, leaving the following expeditions to his brothers and sister. The first to organize an expedition was Thorvald, second son of Eric the Red. We don't know much about him, but from the little we know, we can surmise he wasn't as lucky as his brother. Unfortunately for him, the land that Leif had thought uninhabited was anything but. The two sagas tell two slightly different versions, but in both of them, the Skraeling, how the Vikings referred to the natives, weren't particularly happy with the newcomers. Whether they waited for some time or they attacked immediately, the natives resorted to violence to get rid of the intruders. Compared to the Viking warriors, the natives weren't that skilled, and yet they did manage one high-profile killing. Unfortunately for him, Thorvald was hit by an arrow. He famously pulled it out and poetically recited the phrase, "This is a rich country we have found. There is plenty of fat around my entrails before dying." The remaining members of the expedition buried Thorvald's body in Vinland before going back to Greenland to share the sad news. Not quite so happy with the funerary arrangements, Thorstein, Leif's third brother, decided to organize another expedition to go and fetch his brother's body. Of the 4 children of Eric the Red, he is the only one who never reached Vinland. Beset by foul weather, he was forced to make land in the western settlement of Greenland, where he died in the winter due to an epidemic. Before you think, with reason, that he's the most boring of the siblings, let me tell you that, according to the sagas, he rose from his grave. No, we're not talking about another vampire. He just wanted to tell his wife, Gudrid, who had travelled with him, that she would have a long and happy life and that her offspring would make history. He did love her, don't you think? Gudrid's son, Snorri, would indeed make history as the first European to be born on the North American continent. It was now Freydis' turn. Of all the stories in the sagas, the voyages of Eric the Red's only daughter are the ones that differ the most from one saga to the other. In both the sagas, Freydis is portrayed as a strong and independent woman, but in one of the two there's a more Machiavellian twist to her character. The saga of the Greenlanders tells us that Freydis struck a deal with 2 brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, to go together to Vinland, share the costs of the expeditions, and divide the profits just as equally. Like Thorvald and Thorstein before her, Freydis had obtained permission from her brother Leif to use the buildings he had left in Vinland. As per their agreement, each member of the expedition would bring the same number of members and supplies so that the rewards could be splitted 3 ways. Freydis, though, wasn't happy with this arrangement, so she smuggled 5 extra men on board as part of her expedition. We don't know why, but Freydis' ship arrived in Vinland later than Helgi and Finnbogi, and the brothers would soon regret the lack of peace it brought them. The two brothers had been using the buildings that Leif had left in Vinland, but as soon as Freydish came, she made them move, because, she said, Leif had given her, and only her, permission to use those facilities. To keep the peace, the brothers moved, but that wasn't the end of the disagreements. We have unfortunately no examples, but the situation must have gotten to quite the unbearable point. It was Freydish who decided to solve the situation. One day, she went to the hut the brothers were staying in to ask how they were faring. Not suspecting the treachery that was about to ruin them, they answered truthfully, making the best effort to restore the peace between the two groups. Freydish herself agreed with them, and they made peace. Ah, the powers of a civil conversation, right? Pity that, the moment she exited the hut, Freydish shed the veneer of civility. As she went back to her husband, Freydish told him that Helgi and Finnbogi had beaten her. We don't know if the poor man tried to argue, maybe tipped off by the lack of bruises on his wife, because the saga tells us that Freydish called him a coward and threatened to divorce him on the spot if he didn't avenge her. To keep his marital peace, the husband took his men and slaughtered Helgi, Finnbogi, and all their men. But when he saw that 5 women had remained, he refused to kill them. Freydish, quite ticked off by what she saw as cowardice on his part, asked for an axe and made short work of the women, and then proceeded to threaten with death all the men who had accompanied them on the expedition. That accomplished, she filled her longship with goods and went back to Greenland. For a year all was good, and Freydish enjoyed the wealth and fame she had so craved. But such things have the tendency of coming to light. Word finally reached Leif. As chief, he should have punished Freydish for her highness actions, but as her brother, he didn't quite want to see the punishment through. He resolved to let her be, since her shattered reputation was already quite a punishment in itself. Moreover, he told his people he had foreseen that Freydish descendants would have little fortune in the future, which, according to the saga, seemed to have been quite the statement. The saga ends with everyone thinking ill of Freydish and her descendants. The story of Freydish in the saga of Eric the Red is quite the opposite. It is said that Freydish did go to Vinland, yes, but not as chief of her own expedition, but simply as a member of another. Since she was not the main character in this crew, the saga doesn't tell us much about her. She is virtually invisible until the expedition is attacked by Skraeling. Since the natives had attacked the Viking encampment with projectile weapons, which the Nordic warriors had never seen, they caused a panic, with men fleeing in every direction. It's at this point that an 8-month pregnant Freydish makes her theatrical entrance, all but shouting to the fleeing men, and I quote directly from the saga here, "Why run you away from such worthless creatures, stout men that you are, when, as seems to me likely, you might slaughter them like so many cattle? Let me but have a weapon, I know I could fight better than any of you." She is ignored, but she happens upon one of the fallen Vikings and picks up his sword, engaging the attacking natives, determined to prove her valor. I don't know if it was the sight of a pregnant woman brandishing a sword, if it was her yelling, or if it was the fact that she ripped her shirt and started to beat the hilt of her sword upon her chest, obviously still yelling. In any case, the natives were suitably scared by the display and fled, and Freydish was praised for her courage. So, what do you think? Machiavellian murderess or intrepid heroine? As history cannot give us the answers this time, since to history Freydish might have never existed in the first place, you are free to choose whichever you think suited her best. With Freydish Eriksdottir's story, we are now at the end of this long voyage. As you might imagine, there is enough material both in the sagas and in history to talk for hours about the age of the Viking and its protagonists. I've chosen those whose name and fame still resonate today. Eric the Red didn't put Greenland on the maps, but he did settle it, tying the first knot bonding Greenland to Europe. Leif the Lucky was the bridge between the old continent and what would later become the New World, and I find it fitting that in Iceland, the bridge connecting the continents of Europe and North America bears his name. As for Thorvald, Thorstein, Freydish, and all the others who came after, they might not be as famous as Eric and Leif are, but they've been important in solidifying and tightening the connections between Europe and America. Be it through piracy and raids, or through peaceful exploration and tradings, the Vikings have spread their influence all over the world, known or unknown. Now that our longships are finally back in port, it's time for us to say goodbye. Or, if you don't want to say goodbye, head over to www.theappleandthehero.com and join the community. In 2 weeks, we're going to go back from where we started, Switzerland. We've hopped around Europe a bit in the past episodes, but now I would like to stop in one place for a while, take off our boots, so to speak. From next episode, we're going to deep dive a little bit more in the history of Switzerland and see how different communities decided to work towards common goals in the desperate effort not to be absorbed and destroyed by the mighty neighboring powers. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. Subscribe to get the new episode as soon as they're live. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.